Hello, I'm Gabrielle Weiniger, and you're watching ILTV's Insider. On the show tonight, a debate on Israel's new government and its implications for the future. Israel is set to announce it has a new government this week, with incoming Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu emerging victorious from the country's fifth election in just 3.5 years. It's a comeback for him after a year and a half out of power. The composition already looking pretty clear, appointing Itamar Ben-Gvir as Israel's new national security minister, and the religious Zionism party set to control agencies that regulate civilian life in the West Bank. The far-right party's inclusion in government, a move the New York Times editorial has called a danger to Israel's democracy. This ahead of a Wednesday deadline to negotiate a coalition and just another week after that to swear it in. So, to break it all down, we're joined by the CEO of Israel's Innovation Fund, Adam Bellos, and Asaf Nissan from Israel's Channel 14. Welcome to you both.
Thank you for having us.
Let's dive in straight away and get your take on the New York Times editorial. Is this new government a significant threat to the future of Israel, like it says?
I'll let you go first.
Thank you so much. I think that we could count on the New York Times to be one thing at all times, is totally alarmist. And I think the language of this specific article that you're talking about is a great example of the alarmism that the New York Times is very well known for. It's also very clear to me that they're writing from a non-insider perspective. When I read that, I was like, these people are not Israeli. They don't understand the nuances of Israeli politics. They don't. They have a different system of government in the United States. Here, we have many ministers, but we have a prime minister who oversees everything, who the buck stops with him. So I do actually think it was a very smart move for Netanyahu to come out and say, we're not going to be doing this, we're not going to be doing that, I'm still the prime minister, the state of Israel still stands for this. Bibi's not a Shomer Shabbat Jew by any means whatsoever. So I don't see him wanting to be the governing leader of a country where he can't even live the way that he lives.
Doesn't that mean the coalition will fall apart, the bloc will fall apart?
Not necessarily. I think that, listen, if the bloc falls apart, it'll be because Bibi wants it to fall apart. And that's a very important thing to understand. If you look at his political history, he'll end a government when he sees fit. He even admitted that in 2013, he might have been premature. So I think that's very important to keep in mind.
Do you agree with that it's up to Netanyahu what happens from here?
Yeah, pretty much, Gabby. I'll tell you, seeing it from a perspective of what's going on ever since Netanyahu came back to power from 2009, there was only one government that stood for 4 years, and it was the Netanyahu government up to 2013. Afterwards, I failed to see any government that survived to 4 years full time, and by the way, most of them were Netanyahu. So at the end of the day, Netanyahu himself has a decision and will do the decision whether or not to take out the government or not.
What the New York Times article was saying was that it's basically making the two-state solution impossible because of the right-wing elements that are in this government. They're going to expand settlements. They're going to change the status quo on the Temple Mount. What do you think about that, Asaf?
I don't see this coming forward that quickly. We're talking about something that has happened before. There were right-wing parties all the time. Just because it's a right-wing coalition doesn't promise it's going to be a completely change of a status quo. Of course, there were some elements will be easier. Like talking about the Temple Mount, there might be a little bit of a change in the status quo, but I won't see...
A little bit of a change will have big repercussions, surely.
There should be a change in the status quo on the Temple Mount, in my opinion. Well, the Temple Mount is basically, that's where the apartheid in this country exists, and it exists against Jews. Jews cannot go up there and pray. There's a number of... The Temple Mount is the place where liberalism comes from. It's where the idea that this area was made for every human being to connect to God, go and meet God, so to speak. And not every single person on this earth can go up there peacefully and connect to their maker. And I do think, given Israel's history of allowing religious pluralism to flourish, you don't see that on the Temple Mount. Sorry, I know my view is a little different.
No,
but,
it's fine.
It's a totally important thing that I don't think, by the way, will lead to any pure chaos. They said the same thing about...
the president would say differently with the Intifada and even more recently just changing security cameras on the Temple Mount.
But they said the same thing about the embassy being moved to Jerusalem, and they said the same thing a number of times. And here's the big thing that we've noticed since the Abraham Accords. There's been a big change since the Oslo paradigm failed. And a lot of people would consider that our negotiating stance in the Oslo paradigm was that from a position of weakness. And what we've been able to do through the economic miracles that have kind of happened in Israel since Netanyahu took over the finance ministry is that we've been able to negotiate from a place of strength. And if you look at the language that's being thrown out right now, Netanyahu is pretty much gearing us up to start making peace with Saudi Arabia, which could possibly lead to an end of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So I do
say that, but there has been an uptick of
But it
violence
won't
this year.
end.
We've seen 135
Let's be
Palestinians
honest,
killed,
for sure.
35 Israelis killed,
the two-state
31
solution-
that was
Israelis
happening
killed.
before.
Let's start with the fact that
But it's gone up this year.
it's gone up, it's gone down.
It's gone up
The
the last
issue's
2 years.
always been around. The Biden administration said it won't go back on it. They've been put in a Palestinian affairs official. So I don't think the U.S. is going to let that issue go away pretty much soon.
I agree with you
soon.
completely.
Talking about
Again.
how do you think the U.S. administration is going to deal with this new government? Are they going to sit with Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's been convicted of racism, incitement, and homophobes? Is this something that's going
I
to
don't
happen?
think it's going to be that much of a problem. Let's be honest.
would agree.
The previous administration had people that were very dubious at some point, and a lot of them were in government and didn't do anything wrong. They did actually good work, despite the fact that they were charged. For example, Jared Kushner, if we're talking about a specific case, but he, of course, was still someone who led his peace deals and peace sites throughout the Middle East and changed it to the view. We know it's the Abraham Accords today. So I don't think there's anything wrong with having someone like Ben-Gvir. Again, I would always put myself back because there's a certain point I think he won't cross also because he doesn't want to hurt his status in the Israeli
I can tell
public.
you right now, I spoke to a number of people on Ben-Gvir's team this morning, and there is one thing that the Ben-Gvir camp wants to get out there. He's not the Ben-Gvir of years past, and that he very much is trying to distance himself from the extremist comments that he made in the past. Basically, they're going with the whole argument that he was once a young man, he was brought up a certain way, his time now getting into politics and realizing that there's a bigger picture have mellowed him out. And there's a number of politicians who have had that rep, so to speak. If you remember, 11 years ago, 12 years ago, 10 years ago, they were talking the same way about Naftali Bennett. And look how Naftali Bennett ended up moving almost to the center left, so to speak.
So while the New York Times, goes against that and doesn't buy that, you think that the administration, the Biden administration, any future American administration won't have a problem with this current government?
I don't think that ministers in a government matter as long as we're not hanging homosexuals and forcibly veiling women.
Well, let's have a look at who's the head of the National Jewish Identity, Avi Maoz, who has declared himself a proud homophobe. What do we make of that? What's that going to bring to social change in the country?
I don't think it's going to bring that much of a social change. Everyone is very worried about Avi Maoz, but even Avi Maoz himself, of course, he has said the things that we all know have heard. He's against homosexuality. He's very conservative, and he does speak to a certain crowd. Again, those crowds are still Avi Maoz's decision. At the end of the day, is still under Netanyahu. And as Adam said, there's no change here. Netanyahu is the prime minister. He's not going to let gay rights be affected. He said that much even when he brought in Avi Maoz negotiation.
But if you sit with somebody like that, you support somebody like that.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. You have to remember that political maneuvering is a very important thing. Ron Dermer would argue that the way that they handled the Haredi inclusion in the army in 2013 was not actually the proper way to do it, and that there could have been an entirely different type of shift that was maybe a little bit slower, which is one of the reasons why it was repealed after the 2013 government failed in 2015 or whatever. He calls it a political bank shot. I love the way that he explains it. It's really interesting. But just because you sit with somebody does not mean you legitimize them. If you sit with somebody, you're hoping, I would think, to moderate them, especially in Bibi's pragmatic worldview, because you have to remember the greatest political pragmatist of the 21st century is Benjamin Netanyahu.
Exactly.
And that is a very important thing. So if he wants this government to end in 2 years, it'll end in 2 years. If he wants to keep it for 4 years, it'll be kept for 4 years. I want to go back, though, to one thing that you were saying about Ben-Gvir and what we were talking about. There is this need for his camp to try to normalize him or pragmatize him or centralize him, so to speak, which is very important if they want their party and their party's leader right now to have a future in Israeli politics. But it's very important. You were talking about the uptick in violence. There are two reasons why Ben-Gvir exists in the political landscape today. One is the violence in the streets that have happened in the last 2 or 3 years. Two is Naftali Bennett. Naftali's moved to the center left and allowing his camp to feel betrayed moved people over to Ben-Gvir. That's a fact.
And what was a far-right fringe party who has its heartland in Hebron, which is, an exceptional place.
Without question. Listen, there's nothing wrong with having your headquarters in Hebron. It's the original capital of the Jewish people, and it's a contested area. And if you remember, Hebron is a great example of how Netanyahu has dealt with previous agreements made by previous governments because of the Hebron Protocols when he was first prime minister in '96. But again,
to bring that into the mainstream is quite a big move. It is a big change. You guys are arguing that Bibi, is continuity, but this is a change, I think.
But I don't see it as a change. Like, I understand what you mean, okay? There is a change that the voice boxes or the dovrim, the spokespeople of these camps are maybe a little bit more to the right or to the extreme. And by the way, I consider myself an ally. So to hear the anti-homosexual remarks is very, very difficult for me to deal with.
And to change the right of return, for example, the grandparent law, and not to allow
but it hasn't been changed. They're talking about it. And one thing that politicians love to do is they love to talk. Okay, very rarely do they actually end up doing a lot of the extreme things that they say.
I think it's something to say, oh, well, they're not going to do what they say they're going to do. That's
no. Don't think that I'm dismissing it. Listen, if they want to change the Aliyah laws, like, they're going to hear from me at least. I mean, that's not something that you stay silent
It's not going to go easy.
But
First
I agree. It's not going to. It's Israeli bureaucracy. How hard is it to change anything in this country?
It's not going to pass. First of all, there's a lot of concern, of course, in the U.S. Jewry and around the world. So of course we're seeing a lot of contesting from those camps. And here in Israel, a lot of them, even in the right wing, are saying, I don't know if we're willing to give up that quick, because there's some of them are grandparents that have children, that have relatives abroad who are at some level you can say are questionably Jewish, but they identify themselves as Jewish, and they support Israel. They give all their strength to the country. So what if they weren't born to? Again, it's halachically, I can't speak from that angle, but as my personal feeling, I don't see a difference in that feeling. I mean, if there's a Jew whose one of his parents is Jewish and still supports the land of Israel
and wants to go to the army, let him come.
Exactly.
Like 100%.
Well, you say that, but actually the negotiations over this current government were held up over a military exemption for those who want to study religion full time. That was kind of one of the issues, and why a lot of the current party.
But it was always there, Gabby. It was always there over the years.
It might happen. Now we might see that, and we might see a new Haredi city. We might see closure on Shabbat. We might see changes to the.
We're not going to see a change to the status quo.
We're moving towards Haredi integration into the society, more so.
Exactly.
The opposite, which I think is very important.
And Netanyahu won't allow it. Netanyahu won't go with that decision. We're talking about someone who literally was caught a few weeks ago on a Friday afternoon going to.
Rules, but I don't think that's the case in Israeli politics.
But financially, the country cannot sustain more and more people not only being exempt from the army, but also from taxes.
Exactly.
If you've ever read Michael Oren's 2048 plan, which is about the 100-year anniversary, the centennial of Israel, he talks about how 20% of the population pay like 90% of the taxes. So it's unsustainable. Like, I really, listen, we're in a place where the prime minister who was just reelected is closing out his tenure as prime minister. He has had a vision to implement since the early 2000s. He slowly started to implement his plan as finance minister, then as the head of the Likud after Sharon, and then finally working his way back into the government in 2009. I do not see Netanyahu doing anything for a short-term gain that will actually jeopardize the economic legacy that he has left. And I think that is very important. You must approach Israeli politics with nuance. Every decision has a meaning behind it, in my opinion.
Is that why you think he's elected Aryeh Deri, who's actually been convicted this year of tax fraud?
Twice. Exactly.
Twice.
We're talking about
twice. Last time I was on here, I said he shouldn't be allowed in the government.
Again.
And I don't believe he has a right to even be there.
Again, I don't like him either. I'm not a fan, but at the end of the day, the courts cleared him. Despite the fact that twice.
Once, he went to jail.
Okay, for the first time, but he already passed the law. He already passed the time of waiting before going back to politics. There's no reason for him to go again. Even don't forget, he left the previous government when he was a minister due to the fact he was under investigations, and he went to face those charges. And when he got vindicated, then he came back now as a minister. Again, there's a big question because Aryeh Deri, of course, we all know that the real reason they won the Ministry of Interior and we're talking about, the local powers is more
and
connected.
the health ministry as well.
Exactly. No, the health ministry is not as much as
maybe the health minister will know how to use a computer.
Health minister again. If we look at Litzman, we're kind of wondering if
it's not a disaster.
If it might have been from that. But if we're talking about the interior minister, Deri wants the power to have in the local rabbinates. every city, has its city rabbinate.
Which, by
and he
the way,
wants
is
the
holding
power.
this country back spiritually in a way that can't even be expressed in words.
That's why.
And that is probably one of the biggest linchpins.
By the way,
in
that was a point of
bridge between the
that was a point of
diaspora and
contention between Smotrich and Aryeh Deri on that issue, because
sure.
again, Smotrich wants to bring in something that Matan Kahana and the previous government tried to bring in. He tried to bring more of the religious Zionist into the mainstream of the rabbinate, and of course, it's a big problem for the Haredi because, let's be honest, currently they're still holding positions of power. So for them, losing it to more than the religious Zionist stream is harder for them. So again, they contest a lot of it, and a lot of it should be changed. But in the end of the day, we can't promise everything would happen.
I don't know if Smotrich is that much better than Deri, but
I would.
I know what you're saying, and if you look at it from a nuanced perspective, yeah, he is, but at the same time, Smotrich is a little extreme, to say the least. And I have a problem with a lot of his anti-liberalism and his anti-LGBTQIA comments. I mean, they're just it's not what the foundation of Zionism is. And that's a very important thing to understand. And if you overlook the liberalism that created the state and the mental universe that was created by the readers and the writers who created this country, we start to lose our way.
What do you think is going to happen now to the center-left in society and in the government?
I'll let you go with that one.
Wow, it's a good question, because honestly, right now, we're still seeing the fights amongst themselves. Lapid's not talking to Merav Michaeli, Merav Michaeli's not talking to Gantz, and they're all fighting within each other. Who's to blame for the fault for what happened now?
I want to say something extreme.
Go for it.
It's their fault that Ben Gvir and Smotrich are in power. Plain and simple.
Well, they didn't vote for him.
No, but their inability to create their own bloc or their inability to put their own personal feelings and wanting for power aside.
Because in the end of the day, most of the campaign was anti-Netanyahu.
Exactly.
So when you have that anti-Bibi sentiment leading you, that's a problem.
I agree with you 100%. And if, it's like what Yakimovich made the mistake I think it was 2013 as well, where she was like, I will not sit with Bibi. And if she would have been able to take labor to new heights.
Yeah.
To me, I think that Gantz not joining this government will come off as one of the biggest mistakes in Israeli political history.
Well, I think Netanyahu's one of his main reasons for returning and the way he did it was to cancel his trial. And there is a talk of complete judicial overhaul. What do you make of that?
You really think that that's why he's back?
I think it was important for him to get rid of it.
For 20 years, they've been trying to pin stuff on him, and the only thing they could pin is cigars and champagne. And they weren't even right about the amount of cigars and champagne. I totally get it. The man, in my opinion, sometimes shows a level of excess that maybe isn't appropriate for Israeli culture, okay? And the high taxation and everything else. But at the end of the day, I don't think he's back in office because he wants to get out of corruption charges. I think he's back in office to make peace with...
He is looking to overhaul the legal system, and there's talk of overriding the Supreme Court and other major decisions like that.
Dershowitz actually came out against it. I mean, I thought that was very interesting as well. But I don't see the main reason for him. Would you agree with me on this one? I don't see the main reason for getting back into the hot seat is to avoid...
Yeah, it's not...
He always wanted to be back in the hot seat.
He wanted to be there, doesn't change it. But the issue, again, with the trial, it's not going to... It's not that he wanted to... he wanted to somehow, I don't know, overhaul it, maybe try to... I think at some level he also wanted to play in the option of holding back at bay the entire reform to the fact that they were going to be willing to drop charges. There were talks about in the air, but in the meantime,
what kind of precedent is this set? How can we expect this to influence minority communities?
We're forgetting to see something before that we're actually seeing now that the cases themselves are showing a systematic failure from the prosecution. So in the end of the day, a lot of those cases might fall. And in the end, if we're left with a few champagne bottles and cigars, then there's no really a reason for him to stop, and there's no reason for him to change it. The real reason I think he won't change it is because he came from them. He grew up in that system. He grew up in that society. People forget it, but Netanyahu's family grew up with those same judges. The Supreme Court, he was always in favor of the judicial law, always throughout the entire system. So I don't think it's going to be that much of a change, and he's not going to allow things to go that easy, because in the end of the day, they're the people he grew up with.
Would you agree with that?
Listen, I don't... Forget about who Bibi grew up with for a second, but I do understand why you would bring that up. I think that since Bibi got into power, okay, there has been more intrusion into his personal life there has been more investigations that have happened over the last 20 years, let's say since 1996, okay, or 1999 when he got out of office. And nobody has ever been able to pin anything on him, and they've always actually been wrong, okay? There's also been a lot of talk that a lot of the new cases are being dropped. Like, what was it? Like, what with Ynet, it was like better coverage than bad coverage or something like that?
We'll keep our eye on that. I just want to wrap this up because we're running out of time. Do you have any final remarks? Will this government hold, and will the people continue to support it, and the international community as well?
I'm gonna let you go first.
You want me to go? You should.
Yeah, you go first.
No, please. I definitely think this government will hold up if Bibi wants it to hold up. I think that Israel's enemies, who are, and I say enemies for a very specific reason, anti-Zionists who do not agree with the creation of the Jewish state, will use whatever they can to try to delegitimize Israel. So it's not going to matter if we have a left government or a right government, or we have one extremist or the other from the left or the right in.
It might matter to the people who live in that country and the people in the
it
West
matters
Bank.
to me. I mean, but that's not what you're asking me. Like, if you want my own personal opinion about certain comments and certain ministers' personal lives and what they say, I'll go into that. But I don't think
I
don't think this is going to have the long-term implications that many people are being a little hysterical
Would you
about.
agree with that, Asaf?
I think Netanyahu will hold his government because, like Adam said earlier, I think this is going to be his last government. And if he wants to fulfill his dreams...
I've heard that prediction before.
Everyone heard that prediction before. But again, I think this is going to be the last one because, like Adam said, he's close to completing his official dream, and I don't see any reason he won't stay.
Listen, you make peace with Saudi Arabia, you create a whole new age.
True.
You know, at the end of the day.
We'll watch this space. Adam Bellos, Asaf Nissan, thank you so much for joining us in studio today. And thank you at home for watching ILTV's Insider. Tune in next week for more in-depth discussions on Israel and the Middle East. Or why not let us know what you'd like to discuss? You can put your thoughts in the comment section and we'll cover it next time. Now, for more of the latest updates from Israel and around the world, why not subscribe to the ILTV's newsletter at iltv.tv. That's it from this week's Insider. We'll see you next week.